So I began studying both Hinduism, Sanskrit, and Islam, Arabic, and then Persian, Islamic philosophy, Sufism, and Persian literature. The idea that we don't just have mediated access to reality through the senses. So that became really the fire behind my studies, motivated my studies, and I started with language study especially. So I started working on two projects. One is Sufism as a bridge between Shiism and Sunnism, and the second is looking at pluralism in Persian literature. Really, everybody who comes to him as an entification of the divine reality, really, as he sees the divine qualities in people. So he really embodies that perspective of Ibn Arabi. I think Masnavi and Matnavi is really an ocean. So I would say I've dipped my feet into Maulana Rumi. Really, Mullah Sadri used all of that to solve the main philosophical problems of his day. And it's deeply relevant, I would say, to the contemporary world as well. Now that point is pretty striking because it's so potentially universal. Anything that takes someone to God becomes Islam. And anything that keeps someone away from God becomes kufr. The execution of Halaj is definitely in people's memories. And also people are criticizing the Sufis for saying things that don't conform to the ordinary understandings found in Kalam, for example. So someone like Al-Qudat is face to face with criticism for saying things that other people don't understand. If someone says something you don't understand, don't simply reject it because you don't understand it. There may be levels of knowledge that you don't have access to. Now he'll say that every madhab has its roots in the truth as far as he knows. Even if it's things that he criticizes, like idol worship or Zoroastrian fire worship or Christian worship of the crucifix. So example, fire worship. He doesn't explain what fire worship originally was. He just says you get to a certain point on the path and you have shuhud, you witness what fire worship really is. You witness that people are seeing the light of God within the fire, and that was the origin of this before it got turned into kind of a practice that he doesn't approve of. It both is God and it is not God at the same time. Huwa la huwa. So by the virtue of something existing, there's only one existence, therefore everything is God. But by virtue of being limited, by virtue of this tree being a tree and limiting the divine names and qualities, it is not God. Any particular belief, any personal attribute, any quality we have is like a particular color. It could be red, yellow. There's something beautiful about it. It's good, but it's also a limitation. The divine reality is beyond all of these limitations. So we need to move through the different colors, let's say, the different aspects, manifestations of the divine reality represented by different madhabs, different beliefs. But then we ultimately need to reach this point which is beyond all color. For a fruit to become ripened, the sun has to shine on it continually for a certain amount of time, and very, very gradually that fruit will become ripened. The soul and the knowledge of the inward is really the same. It has to gradually be exposed to the light of truth, which comes through the prayers. But Al-Qudat's idea is different. Because he says anything that leads a person to God is Islam, that means any idea in that whole circle, if it's moving towards God, it's Islam. But if it's not moving towards God, if it's stationary, then it's kufr. So the idea of movement is really important here, and potentially, even if someone you don't know that they're a Muslim or you don't see them as a Muslim, potentially if they're moving towards God, Al-Qudat would include them and value them. His idea of truth can be potentially very universal, but his idea of kufr can also be potentially very universal. He completely reverses the logic of Islam and who is a Muslim, and he's placing the tariqah, the path, the rah, as in Persian, he's placing that at the center of Islam. So he's really placing Sufism at the center of Islam and making fiqh and kalam and so forth more marginal. That's the only thing humans need to do, is to journey towards God. Then if you practice fiqh, yes, that's because you need to do that in order to perform the journey. So the fiqh is secondary. As you know, he was executed on charges of heresy for political reasons. But one before that, he was taken to prison, and he was interrogated on the basis of these ideas. Actually, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who is such a important influence on Al-Qudat, but the criteria that he laid out of, does God know particulars, is the world eternal, and is resurrection bodily, and also on this charge of being an Ismaili. Al-Qudat was interrogated on all of these. So basically, Ikhwan al-Safa and Al-Qudat are saying, why bother with other people's religions and criticizing them? Focus on your own religion, focus on your own search for God, and leave everything else aside, leave everybody else in God's hands. The capital sin in Al-Qudat is stopping. If you stop at the star, that's a mistake. But if you go onto the moon, the sun, and then realize the nature of God, then that's correct. So if you're simply doing something because that's what your parents told you to do, you're worshipping an idol of adah. If you don't understand what the awliya, what the Sufis are talking about, don't criticize them, because they might be seeing a deeper meaning that you don't have access to. So Al-Qudat's idea is really fascinating, actually, that all religion, all religious beliefs, all religious doctrines had an origin in truth, but then people who hadn't seen that, hadn't gained the ma'rifah, talked about it, and they ended up getting things wrong. And that's how corruption happens for him in religious doctrines. Ultimately, for Ibn Arabi, the people who end up in the hellfire, ultimately, they also are within the divine mercy, but it's incomparable with, they're veiled from God. It's incomparable with the bliss that is experienced by the people who are able to enter the garden. The fundamental teaching is a call for us to return to our own hearts and to cultivate our humanity in its fullest sense. And part of that cultivation of humanity is to be able to see the truth wherever it manifests. There's no need for us to be judging other people. That function, according to all of these poets and thinkers and philosophers, belongs to God alone.
الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. نرحب بكم في سلسلة حوارات فكرية ومعرفية على قناة حيرة. In this interview, we are interviewing Dr. Nicholas Boylston from the United Kingdom. And Dr. Nicholas completed his PhD at Georgetown University in the United States in the topic of religious pluralism and Islamic studies in 2017. And he started teaching in Harvard University in Boston for the past 3 years in Islamic studies. And he is now an assistant professor in Seattle University. So welcome, Dr. It's an honor having you with us today.
Thank you so much, Hadi. It's a pleasure to be here today.
I forgot to mention that your PhD was focusing on the issue of religious pluralism also, and the doctrine of three great Sufi and scholars, which are Sana'i, Ayn al-Qudat al-Hamdani, and Farid al-Din al-Attar al-Nayshaburi. So before we start talking about this topic, the topic of our interview, which is religious pluralism and the doctrine of Ayn al-Qudat specifically, tell us more about yourself, your academic path in religious and Irfani and Sufi studies, your interest in this field, and how it started, how it developed, maybe the main teachers that influenced you.
Thank you so much. So I was born and raised in England and grew up in the north of England, and really philosophical questions arose for me fairly early in life. Around 15 or 16, I became deeply engaged in these questions of what it means to be human, what is real, how do we know what we know, and what is the good. So I started doing research. There was a kind of fire there to really understand these things, and I wasn't happy with any of the explanations around me. So I started reading Western philosophy, and also gradually also started reading traditions like Hinduism and Buddhism as well. And I remember a pivotal moment came when I read Bertrand Russell and The Problems of Philosophy. He says, with reason, we can't even know that the outside world exists. So this problem of doubt, of skepticism, was really important for me. And what attracted me, I would say, to Hinduism at that time was this idea that it's possible to know things directly, the idea of jnana. And I would find that more explicitly and in more detail when I started studying Islam once I went to college at Harvard. So I began studying both Hinduism, Sanskrit, and Islam, Arabic, and then Persian, Islamic philosophy, Sufism, and Persian literature, really to understand this idea of irfan and ma'rifah, because once you have an idea of ma'rifah, the whole significance of human life changes. The idea that we don't just have mediated access to reality through the senses, through testimony, through what we've heard from other people, where we can directly know things as they really are. So that became really the fire behind my studies, motivated my studies, and I started with language study especially. And then I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to go to Iran and to study Islamic philosophy. So I lived in the Iranian Institute of Philosophy and studied with Dr. Ghulam Raza A'vani there, Islamic philosophy, Shia Hadith, and also Irfan texts. And then I also did a master's degree in Islamic philosophy at the University of Tehran and studied with Dr. Qara Maliki and Dr. Dinani and several other professors. And I also was studying Islamic philosophy Muladhara with Ayatollah Muhaqqaq Damad in Tehran as well. While at the same time studying Persian literature and actually Persian classical music as well. So this was a really pivotal point in my intellectual life, being immersed in Persian culture, being immersed in the Islamic tradition, see the living Islamic tradition, how it was practiced, and also the living tradition of Islamic philosophy and Irfan, how this is really part of the culture and is a taught tradition today. So after about 3.5 years, I decided, okay, it's time to return to America and to find a way to kind of share what I've learned and continue deepening my understanding of it. And rather than simply choosing a single topic, I was really attracted to the idea of choosing a problem that's important within the world. How are we going to use this knowledge to actually benefit humanity? So I joined a program at Georgetown that focuses only on religious pluralism. Every PhD student in the religion program at Georgetown just focuses on pluralism, usually between two religions, Islam and Christianity, Buddhism and Christianity. And I suggested we need to do pluralism within Islam. So we need to look at relationships between Sunnis and Shia, and also between Sufism and the different branches. So I started working on two projects. One is Sufism as a bridge between Shiism and Sunnism. And the second is looking at pluralism in Persian literature, which is what I ended up working on. And I worked with Paul Heck and Daniel Madigan there, as well as Jonathan Brown. And I also was visiting George Washington University and worked with Sayyid Hussein Nasser during that time as well. And spending also some time in Boston, I've been able to benefit from James Morris teaching Ibn Arabi in particular. So it's been a real blessing over the years to benefit from really fantastic teachers, and I feel really blessed to have benefited from these luminaries and kind of hopefully be able to share a little bit of what they've taught me as I continue this process of deepening my own knowledge.
Great and very detailed story. Huh? So if you'd like to tell us more about the time you spent with Professor James Morris and what exactly you studied with him, or also with Dr. Sayyid Hussein Nasser?
Sure. So with James Morris, he would have a weekly session on Ibn Arabi. He's been running this, it cut off because of COVID, but it will probably start again. He's been running this though for about 7 or 8 years. And at first he selected some passages of the Futuhat, and then around the time I got to Boston, he started teaching the Fusus, and we went through the whole Fusus, and then we started reading sections from the Futuhat, particularly cosmological sections, the chapters in the 50s, as well as the introduction. His method is it's like a combination of the kind of traditional method and the Western seminar method. So we would go in a circle and we would actually, the students would translate, and then we would discuss every single line and every single word. And Professor Morris would really be guiding us through every step of the process. So he was empowering us to be able to read the text ourselves, rather than just giving his own commentary. And that was profoundly influential, to see the way he reads the text, and also the way he connects it to everyday life. That's one of his real keys, as you've seen in this program, is that everything he reads, even if it's on a very high intellectual level, he sees it in everyday life, and how it plays out and what the practical implications of that were. So that's been really important. And then Sayyid Hussein Nasser, I attended his classes and also studied some texts with him, and he also gave me really crucial guidance on my academic journey and methodologies of scholarship and things like that. So he's been a really, really generous resource to me along my journey as well.
Mm-hmm. So mentioning Professor Morris, so in his teaching, he combines between the theoretical and the practical aspects of a text, especially of Ibn Arabi's text.
I would say that, yes, but he doesn't give you instructions like go and do this, go and do this practical thing. He just embodies really the teachings of Ibn Arabi in the way he sees, he sees really everybody who comes to him as an identification of the divine reality, really, as he sees the divine qualities in people. So he really embodies that perspective of Ibn Arabi, I think, rather than teaching a particular practical method, just to see that embodied in how he views the world through this lens of someone who's been reading Ibn Arabi for decades and decades has been really influential.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And during the 3 years you spent in Iran, how your interest in Irfani studies, or especially the Persian literature, developed and enhanced there?
Yes, so that was really one of my fundamental motivations for going to Iran. And I had a lot of work to do on the language. And fortunately, at the Iranian Institute of Philosophy, I was given private instruction, and they were extremely kind to me. So I started with Sa'di's Golistan, which was recommended to me, which talks about really practical wisdom on an everyday life. And it's full of humor, but it's also Persian of the highest level and really teaches you the language. I was also reading the Masnavi with Dr. Pahariyahi, which was extremely significant as well. So Maulana Rumi has always been an important guide for me, but I also feel like I've only just started to taste the tip of what he has to offer. The Masnavi and Matnavi is really an ocean. So I would say I've dipped my feet into Maulana Rumi. And then also, as my Persian improved, Hafez is one of the most difficult poets, but starting to really develop an intimacy with Hafez and to do the fall of Hafez, where we ask Hafez a question and then open up the book, has been a really important guide. I started reading the Fusus in Iran, but I really wasn't ready for it. So that took some more years before I could gain the intellectual training to really understand a little bit of the Fusus. And I also started reading Al-Qudat Hamdani in Iran. So I should also mention my teacher, Dr. Ali Khani, who taught Al-Qudat there, as well as Tafsir Maybudi and some of these other important texts. So I really owe my fundamental understanding and ability to read the text of Al-Qudat Hamdani to Dr. Ali Khani.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You're also interested in reading the Shi'i Irfan manifested in Mullah Sadra or Sayyid Haidar al-Amuli or other scholars also?
Yes. So I decided to pursue a master's degree in Islamic philosophy, really with the goal of reading Mullah Sadra. So they teach you the logic, they teach you Avicenna's text, they teach you Suhrawardi, and it kind of culminates in Mullah Sadra, which is such a profound exposition of particularly ontology, and really joins together the systematic methods of Avicenna with the deep insights of the interpreters of Ibn Arabi like Qunawi and Qaysari. And then really Mullah Sadri used all of that to solve the main philosophical problems of his day. And it's deeply relevant, I would say, to the contemporary world as well. Mullah Sadr gives you the tools to really think about everything on the level of ontology. So that was deeply important for me, and a really important part of my training. And now I've actually come back to Amali, who I started reading in Iran, but I've come back to him to be working on his tafsir, al-Muhit al-A'zam, to really think about tafsir as a means of kind of bridging or seeing the confluence of Sufism and Twelver Shi'ism.
Great. So after this introduction, Dr. allow us to start in the topic of our meeting, which is religious pluralism, and it's obviously a very deep, comprehensive and interesting subject. Actually, it is an unending journey of research, especially with the theories of modern scholars, starting from the traditionalist or perennial school like Shawon or René Guénon, and now Said Hussein Nasr, or Professor William Chittick, or Professor James Morris even, or also Professor Leonard Eliasson, who has some ideas on this issue also, or Reza Shah Kazemi, or others. And there is different Sufi and mystical dimensions of this theory. So starting in this context also, you have an interesting article which is published in the Journal of Islamic Studies in Harvard University, titled Islam from the Inside Out, Ayn al-Qudat al-Hamdani, Reconception of Islam as Vector. So, and I think this is a part of your PhD also. So today our talk will focus on the theory of Ayn al-Qudat al-Hamdani on pluralism and diversity, trying to understand it very comprehensively. So in the beginning, I think that his main idea is that a true Muslim who turns towards God, who can see the aspects of truth in everything he hears, who can see the batin, not only the zahir, who can listen to the call of his fitra, of his instinct. So in the beginning, how can we start knowing or understanding this theory?
Excellent. And that quotation is very well chosen. I'd written that quotation to share as well. Al-Qudat's theory of religious diversity is extremely multifaceted. And as you say, this is such a complex topic. The more you go into it, the more complex it becomes. So I think it's useful to try and tease this out a bit, to try and simplify it into its basic building blocks. Now, point number one here is, what is Al-Qudat writing for? Just in general, when he's writing his letters to his disciples, you know, he's this 6th century, early 12th century mystic. He ends up being executed. He's very similar to Hallaj in many ways. He has this keen intellect, but this ecstatic side as well, and it ends up getting him in trouble. So he's writing these letters to his disciples. What is actually his purpose? Well, his purpose is simple. He's trying to make people better. A lot of Sufism really boils down to this: helping people to be more human, helping people to really actualize the potential in the human state. But the audience he's speaking to is Muslim. And that's very important for understanding this. This theory doesn't exist kind of in a vacuum or in space. He's speaking it to its audience. And the fact that he's writing letters when he's doing that is really significant. There's a specific addressee in mind, but he also says that he's going to write things which aren't meant just for that addressee and are meant for either a broader audience or some people in the future who will actually come and be able to understand them. So first of all, he's writing to Muslims, and his purpose is to make Muslims better human beings, or to make them better Muslims. So that's the key point here. It's not simply a theology of religions, as we would say when we think about early 20th century kind of approaches to the theology of the religious other. It's about turning his readers into better Muslims. Now, his starting point, or the starting point, let's say, that I took in this article, is the statement: whatever leads a man to God is Islam, and whatever keeps a man from the way of God is kufr, is infidelity. Now, that point is pretty striking because it's so potentially universal. Anything that takes someone to God becomes Islam. And anything that keeps someone away from God becomes kufr. And I start the article by just thinking about whether he means that literally. And by the end of the article, I try and say, no, he does mean it literally. He's not just being rhetorical. He's not just saying Islam leads someone to God and the ordinary understanding of Islam. He's literally trying to flip your understanding of Islam and rebuild the religion from scratch. So we need to kind of go step by step together, I would say, in order to figure out how exactly he does that.
Great, Dr. Nicholas. So we'll go step by step in trying to understanding this theory and the new meaning of Islam that he's presenting here. So I think also then he'll relate Islam with taslim, with submission, and he'll believe that submission is the real essence of Islam, not the Islam that we are practicing only. So in the beginning, Islam as indicating the quality of an individual's relationship with God, his spiritual experience, his personal experience with God, rather than the mere entry into a religious community. I think this is one of his main ideas. And he also says that it's about actively moving towards God. So all those who are not, in fact, moving towards God are not actually Muslim, even though if they're in the society and community called Muslims.
Yes, and this last point is a key one. So we have to think actually, what is Al-Qudat arguing against? And I would say the key opponent really is two things. First of all, it's taqlid, blind imitation, people who simply follow the religion that they've received from the community around them, from their parents. And the second is actually certain members of the ulama class who are using religion in Al-Qudat's view for their own political purposes. So as a whole, these groups of people are the ones that Al-Qudat is really arguing against with this definition. This is something common actually in Persian literature in this period, when the legal schools have become well established, the disciplines of legal training have become well established as well, and the madrasas have become very powerful. There now emerges groups of particularly Sufis who want to criticize these individuals and say that there are people here who have taken religious power for the sake of personal interests, for the sake of personal political gain. So figures like Ahmad al-Ghazali or Sana'i or Al-Qudat, they're really trying to revive Islam by criticizing those people who are using the formal aspects of Islam for their own personal gain. So when Al-Qudat says that Islam is whatever brings someone to God, and kufr is anything that brings you away from God, if the formal practice of Islam, if wearing a turban, for example, and teaching in a mosque, if you're doing that for the sake of your ego, if you're doing that for political gain, that could lead you away from God. So that kind of false Islam, the hypocrisy, the nifaq, that is kufr for Al-Qudat. And then we have to talk about what true Islam then is. So he's shifting the meaning. Islam isn't just whoever says the Shahada, whoever claims to be a Muslim. Islam is sincere practice of Islam. And the false, insincere practice actually is keeping people away from God, and that is therefore kufr, is infidelity.
So this is a very wide definition about Islam, which may also include other people which are not titled Muslims, and we'll go there in the idea of the circle, we'll reach there. But first you also talk about the idea that the one who turns towards God is muqbil versus the mudbir. And even if this muqbil hears thousands words of infidelity and shirk, he brings out from each one of them a true aspect from the innate disposition, gharizat in Farsi, or fitra, from his own knowledge. So the attribute of Muslims is this: those who listen to the word, then follow what is most beautiful of it. الذين يستمعون القول فيتبعون أحسنه. And I think he has a very interesting explanation of this ayah.
Yes. So part of the challenge here is that in this period, the Sufis are getting criticized very much. The execution of Hallaj is definitely in people's memories. And also people are criticizing the Sufis for saying things that don't conform to the ordinary understandings found in Kalam, for example. So someone like Al-Qudat is face to face with criticism for saying things that other people don't understand. So this statement is partly in a response to that. Part of what Al-Qudat wants to say is that if someone says something you don't understand, don't simply reject it because you don't understand it. There may be levels of knowledge that you don't have access to. So basically, we'll talk later, hopefully, about the distinction between ilm and ma'rifah. But Al-Qudat is saying often, ilm is not enough. Conceptual knowledge learned in the madrasas is not enough. That's something positive and good, but there's a level beyond it, which is ma'rifah. So for the people who just have ilm, don't deny what the Sufis are saying, which is based on direct knowledge and ma'rifah. The second point here is basically that true Islam, or what he calls the people who are muqbal, who are successful or turning towards God, or it can also mean that the people who are saved in the hereafter as well. The people who have these qualities, it's really an interior trait that makes them Muslims. And that interior trait is they're always seeking God. They're always seeking the truth. So they will seek the truth in absolutely everything. If you show them something which is 90% false and 10% true, they'll take the 10% true and get rid of the 90% falsehood. Whereas the person who is the opposite will just reject the whole thing because it's entirely, and call it entirely false. So they'll reject the 10% of truth. So Al-Qudat perhaps is thinking of the verse, wheresoever you turn, there is the face of God. The person who is a true Muslim is able to see the divine presence. فأينما تولوا فثم وجه الله. أينما تولوا فثم وجه الله. Wheresoever you turn, there's the face of God. To be able to see the divine reality in all things. That doesn't mean everything is equally true. That doesn't mean everything is equally beautiful. But the person who's the muqbal, the person who's successful, who turns towards God, will be able to use everything as a means of returning to God. Whereas the person who has the opposite quality is looking for an excuse actually to deny the truth.
If you can elaborate more on this idea, so a muqbil will find the face of God in all different doctrines and theologies and practices of all different sectors within Islam, or also in different religions and societies. So how can he find the face of God among all this diversity and plural, different things?
So this really depends on later aspects of Al-Qudat's theory of religious pluralism. And he's going to come up with a theory basically that every madhab has its roots in truth, but then some have become corrupted. So when he says the word madhab, he doesn't just mean legal madhab. The word also used to mean opinion, or any school of thought based on a particular opinion, or just a way of going, a method of acting, the most broadest meaning of the term madhab. So any madhab, any school, any idea, any way of proceeding that leads someone to God, he'll say is Islam. Now he'll say that every madhab has its roots in the truth as far as he knows. Even if it's things that he criticizes, like idol worship, or Zoroastrian fire worship, or Christian worship of the crucifix. These things on their own terms he doesn't approve of, but he believes that originally they had a true source. There were people who had ma'rifah, who had gnosis, who had direct knowledge, who reached some kind of realization or tahaqquq of these things. And then they talked to other people about them who misunderstood them and turned them into these kind of practices. So Al-Qudat's idea is, if you take any religious doctrine, there is a truth behind it somewhere. But because language is not sufficient to convey ma'rifah, language is limited, language is always ambiguous. When somebody who has attained ma'rifah communicates it to other people, they're liable to misunderstand it. So what that means is the muqbil, the person who is a true Muslim, who is seeking God in everything, when he or she encounters a particular religious doctrine, they don't just accept it as it is, because it might be false, but they look to the depths of it to see what the grain of truth, the kernel of truth behind that doctrine might be. And he actually says on the journey towards God, you actually move through different way stations. So this is another important part of his doctrine that perhaps we'll return to.
Any example in your mind how a person can find truth in a false doctrine or in a muharraf doctrine?
The example he will give is Sufism, the Greek school. But by Al-Qudat's time, Sufism had come to mean that the world didn't exist at all. And he says, look, the idea that the world doesn't exist is absurd, because you have to exist to say that. But there may be a truth behind that was the origin of that doctrine. And obviously people misunderstood it, because nobody would believe this absurd doctrine. So the original people who believed that doctrine must have believed something else. And for Al-Qudat will always interpret this in a Sufi way. So he'll interpret this as meaning, for example, only God truly exists. Kan Allah wa lam yakun ma'ahu shay'in huwa al-an kama kan. God was and there was nothing with him. And then the response that the Sufis have added is he is now even as he was. He'll see that as the origin of this absurd philosophical view that the world doesn't exist, for example. So what he'll do is he'll find the kind of a true principle that could be corrupted into this other point of view. Now, it turns out historically that might not be right. Some of his interpretations historically turn out to be very interesting, and some of them, he's slightly incorrect. But he's actually saying that a lot of this is ineffable. So, example, fire worship. He doesn't explain what fire worship originally was. He just says you get to a certain point on the path and you have shuhud. You witness what fire worship really is. You witness that people are seeing the light of God within the fire, and that was the origin of this before it got turned into kind of a practice that he doesn't approve of. So it's ultimately through cultivating spiritual insight that one sees the grain of truth within these that may have become corrupted.
So then one sees what?
Really, I mean, it really goes back to Ma'rifah for Al-Qudat, direct gnosis of God. He would say that one is able to see, let's say, that fire is a symbol of light, and that Allahu Nur as-samawati wal ard, God is the light of the heavens of the earth. So that once you can see that the symbolism of fire, you can see the true origin. You can see the light of God manifested within the fire, and then you know why people would worship it, even though you don't approve of the worship of fire itself as a Muslim, obviously. But you see the light of God manifested there. So you see one point in the path in which fire worshipping appears correct. He also says, though, as I think we'll discuss, don't stay there. You have to keep going on the journey. You can't limit yourself to that one perspective, but that perspective does exist where you see that the true origin of fire worship, for example.
Great. I think another example would be that there are religious doctrines which say that we have two gods, the god of good and the god of evil. Maybe you will explain.
Yes, precisely. He calls that the Qadariya madhab, based on the meaning of that term, which had begun to be a question of the doctrine of free will, and then by Al-Qudat's time had been conflated with a kind of Zoroastrian Manichaean idea of two gods, really a Zoroastrian dualism of a god of goodness and a god of creating evil. He calls that the Qadariya madhab just for some interesting historical reasons, but he says again, he uses this as an example of how tahrif or corruption of madhabs comes about through language. So somebody originally had a ma'rifah and they saw only good in creation. So they said something like, God is the only one who creates anything. It's Tawheed Af'ali, divine unity is manifested in the divine action, seeing God as the only actor. But somebody heard this and thought, therefore God creates evil. But God, the God who is good, can't create evil, so there must be another divinity that creates evil. So this kind of stage by stage, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but this stage by stage corruption where somebody hears a mystic talking about divine unity and then misinterprets, and through history you end up with this idea that you have a separate God. Now what he'll do is he'll reinterpret that and say, well, the first half of that statement, that God only creates goodness, is true. The second half of the statement, therefore there is another God who creates evil, is false, and he'll put that aside. But then he'll go into the nature of evil and the problem of evil and his theodicy in a very, very deep way. And again, that returns to ma'rifah. It's not something for Al-Qudat that can be expressed in language.
Great. And also, Doctor, I think we can also relate to the idea which Ibn Arabi, which comes after Ayn al-Qudat, when he talks about the your heart or my heart has become receptive or capable of all forms. I think this idea is that all the beliefs I can understand them within my spiritual experience. I don't know if it's related or no.
It's very related in some interesting ways. I would say on certain points, Al-Qudat and Ibn Arabi very much agree, even though Ibn Arabi was not reading these texts. Ibn Arabi had knew about Al-Qudat and may have read his Arabic work, Zabtat al-Haqa'iq, or heard about it. But the works we're talking about with Al-Qudat's doctrine of religious diversity were in Persian, so Ibn Arabi hadn't read them. But Ibn Arabi wants to say, Ibn Arabi, part of what Ibn Arabi is saying is that all of creation is a manifestation of God. It both is God and it is not God at the same time. Huwa la huwa. So by the virtue of something existing, there's only one existence, therefore everything is God. But by virtue of being limited, by virtue of this tree being a tree and limiting the divine names and qualities, it is not God. So Ibn Arabi is also saying, this also applies to religious beliefs. Every belief in some way manifests being, it manifests truth, so it's a manifestation of the divine. But at the other time, every belief, every i'tiqad limits truth. It's a not in being. So every belief also manifests something of the truth and limits the truth for Ibn Arabi. So Ibn Arabi is able to see, well, you can look at every belief and see the truth manifested in there, but you also have to kind of get beyond the way the truth is limited. So this idea of huwa la huwa in Ibn Arabi is really significant. Al-Qudat is also saying the wayfarer, the salik, the person on the spiritual path, should be able to see every religious doctrine and discern between the truth and the falsehood within it. So in that way, it's similar. But for Al-Qudat, it's like a journey. So he says, if I want to go from Hamadan to Mecca to make the Hajj, I have to pass through Baghdad. So passing through Baghdad is fine, but I can't stay in Baghdad. If I stay in Baghdad, I'll never make the Hajj. I'll never get to Mecca. So it's similar. If you want to make the journey to God, you may pass through a certain doctrine. For example, you may start thinking of the divine qualities. Let's say Rahmah. You may think of the divine mercy as being like your mother's mercy. And you have a very anthropomorphic idea of God. That might be good. Actually, it's technically wrong, and the mutakallimin will correct you for it. But it might be good at the beginning to have that idea, so you can relate to the divine mercy. So you start off the journey, you get to Baghdad, you have this idea of the divine qualities, and it's helpful for you. But then you pass beyond that, and you realize that God's mercy is infinite, and your mother's mercy is limited. So his idea is a bit more sequential, where you have to go through every madhab, you have to see how it's true, but you should never stop in this journey. You need to keep going. And at the end of the path, you get to a point where, in a sense, you're beyond all madhabs. So he loves this quotation from Al-Hallaj, where he says, they asked Hussein ibn Mansur, what madhab do you follow? He replied, I'm on the madhab of my Lord. So at the end of the path, one simply follows the divine command directly without having to follow Shafi'i or Abu Hanifa. And then Al-Qudat adds this poem, that one who painted the world with 1,000 colors, how would he buy the color of you and I, O you who are bereft? All this color is but lust or conjecture. He is without color. One must be colored like him. So what Al-Qudat is saying here is any particular belief, any personal attribute, any quality we have is like a particular color. Could be red, yellow. There's something beautiful about it. It's good, but it's also a limitation. The divine reality is beyond all of these limitations. So we need to move through the different colors, let's say, the different aspects, manifestations of the divine reality represented by different madhabs, different beliefs. But then we ultimately need to reach this point, which is beyond all color, beyond all limitation, or Ibn Arabi would say beyond all ta'ayyun. But it's actually slightly different from Ibn Arabi's view, where the ta'ayyun, the tajalli keeps going and continues almost eternally, for example. Al-Qudat is more focused on the single point of unity beyond all of that.
Good. I think it's also related to the idea which Urafa talk about, like in your station as a salik, you should move from metaphoric love, al-hubb al-majazi, to real love, al-hubb al-haqiqa. Maybe it's related also.
It's definitely related to that, and that's definitely one of the kind of symbolic paradigms that Al-Qudat uses. The idea of love moving from a limited love to a love of creatures to love of the divine, and eventually love of everything through the love of divine for Al-Qudat. So precisely, it's a perspective based on journeying, based on suluk, based on wayfaring. All of Al-Qudat's ideas can be interpreted through this idea of this gradual journey. Maybe at the beginning, it's particularly beneficial to just love another human being. Love is a very positive thing. But as one progresses on the spiritual path, loving the divine reality is obviously much more central. And then at a certain point, even the creation is loved because of its relation with the divine reality.
I think also in the Irfani doctrine, they'll say that in the issue of beliefs that you mentioned, like go beyond your beliefs and go beyond your conceptual limited images about the realities about God until you reach to the God's manifestations. انتقل من العقائد والصور الذهنية إلى التجليات الإلهية الكامنة في هذه الصور الذهنية، تجاوزها.
Right, exactly. And so Al-Qudat is all about that. He's saying you have to pass through the beliefs. You can't just say, I'm going to go beyond beliefs, because that would mean you didn't believe in anything. You have to pass through these different beliefs, realize the truth in them, which is like the tajalliyat that you're speaking about. He doesn't use that terminology because that comes in a little bit later with Ibn Arabi, but essentially he's saying go to the kernel of truth in all these madhabs and then keep going, keep the journey towards the divine reality who is beyond them.
Okay, let us go back to Ayn al-Qudat, because we went to different ideas of Ayn al-Qudat also, but returning back to the idea of Islam. So how can we understand the notion of Islam, the reality of Islam, this term, in a more comprehensive way in Ayn al-Qudat doctrine, especially when he relates Islam with taslim, submission, and he believes that Islam is not what we believe of practicing prayers or practicing the Sharia, or the Islam that is in our minds, which is related to a certain community or people who entered this community. No, Islam is about the level or the extent that a person submitted to God.
Yes. So Al-Qudat, he's referring to the Quran here. He's really pointing out that the Quran uses the term Muslim to refer to Abraham, and it uses the term Muslim to refer to the apostles of Christ. So that means for Al-Qudat, Islam is not limited to a particular historical religion. And this goes back to his idea that whatever leads someone to God is Islam. Now, we have to be careful here. So that doesn't mean that he's not in favor of people saying their prayers. That doesn't mean he's not in favor of people following the Sharia. He actually has quite a detailed and complex doctrine here. It doesn't mean he's not in favor of people fasting Ramadan. But what he's saying is, don't simply say the prayers. Don't simply Do your fast because your parents told you to. Don't simply follow these things blindly. He says, first of all, start with this idea. Do you want to seek God? Do you want to seek the truth? Start with that. Once you've started with that, then even don't say, okay, I need to be a Muslim for that. First of all religion should be equal for you, and you should simply seek the truth. Then for him, he does find the truth in Islam, and he finds the most perfect expression of that through the example of the Prophet Muhammad. And from there, he'll say, okay, then you need a representative of the Prophet Muhammad. So you need a spiritual guide to help you on this journey. And in order to get to God, the guide knows the journey, so he'll tell you what to do. Now, what Al-Qudat expects the guide to tell you to do is to pray and to do your fasting. So the follower of Al-Qudat does do the same practices, ultimately, that every other Muslim is doing, but do it for a different reason. They do it simply seeking to travel towards God. And he says, acquaintance with the inward happens gradually. That's acquaintance, knowledge of the inner reality happens gradually, like the ripening of a fruit. For a fruit to become ripened, the sun has to shine on it continually for a certain amount of time, and very, very gradually, that fruit will become ripened. The soul and the knowledge of the inward is really the same. It has to gradually be exposed to the light of truth, which comes through the prayers, it comes through the Quran, it comes through associating with spiritual people, it comes through associating with the example of the Prophet Muhammad. And through that gradual exposure to the light of truth, then the soul is gradually transformed. And this wayfaring starts to take place. So he will tell his disciples to pray. In fact, he has many, many letters explaining the details of prayer. And for example, the significance of saying Allahu Akbar, or the difference between saying Allahu Akbar and saying Allahu Akbar Kabiran. He has some really subtle points of different levels of Tawheed manifested in these different sayings. But the purpose of all this is to lead you to God, rather than doing it simply because you've been told to, or doing the prayers so you'll look good in front of your friends who are pious and pride themselves on saying prayers, or in order to gain paradise, for example. The only reason for Al-Qudat to do these things is to gain the divine reality. So that's why I refer to this as Islam from the inside out. First of all, he takes apart Islam and he says, we're only here to seek God. That's all we're supposed to do. And then he ends up putting it back together and saying, yes, you need to say the prayers, you need to fast and everything, because that's what brings you to God.
Mm-hmm. So basically, it's a new version of Islam, which is embodied consciously with your full intention, not because of taqlid and not because of ta'assub. So it's a new version that you discovered yourself with your own journey, with your own free will.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Dr. Hill will go to another aspect of his theory, which is very important, because now he's talking to Muslims, but when we understand his theory, we can apply it to all different people. So here I think the idea of a circle will come, but also before the circle, he says that there is no difference in principles, which is Tawheed and Ma'ad and the main principles and the belief in prophets. But Tafarruq comes due to places and times. So Amsar and Asar.
Yeah, this is actually an idea that expressed in the Rasail Ikhwan al-Safa, the treatises of the Brethren of Purity. And he's definitely reading those. So because the Brethren of Purity are a philosophical group and they're writing a philosophical text. Now, when you take a philosophical approach, you're looking for, your goal is hikmah, your goal is ma'rifah, your goal is knowledge of the truth. People who take, in Islamic intellectual history, people who've taken this approach have tend to be more universal. That is, they're able to see the truth anywhere and see it as a correct manifestation. So the Islamic philosophers obviously saw Plato and Aristotle as having true wisdom. Someone like Shahabuddin Suhrawardi al-Maqtul talks about al-Hikmat al-Atiqa, the ancient wisdom. He sees the truth in pre-Islamic Persian kings, in pre-Socratic philosophers, and particularly in the Sufis. So his perspective is seeking wisdom, and when the point of departure is to seek wisdom, these thinkers will see wisdom in multiple places, and they'll see how it is adapted to different circumstances. So Al-Qudat is very much influenced by that, and therefore he sees wisdom, manifest everywhere, which is also connected to an important Islamic doctrine of لِكُلِّ أُمَّةٍ رَسُولٌ. There's a messenger for every community. So the universality of prophecy and the universality of wisdom. And then they'll come and argue with the Ikhwan al-Safa, say this, that all of these true traditions believe in the same things, fundamentally the same usul, tawheed, ma'ad, a couple of other things. But obviously there's difference based on time and place. And Al-Qudat really agrees with that.
And also you mentioned in the article that the Ikhwan al-Safa are particularly interested in the causes of this diversity. It results from differences in the contexts in which the prophets must practice their medicine of the soul, as well as differences in the interpretation of revelation, which might result from linguistic challenges or different levels of understanding.
Right, so here this is a point where the Ikhwan al-Safa and Al-Qudat are again very similar. And I would say also Ibn Arabi takes this in a sense to a new level. First of all, there's a wisdom in diversity. So if you think about it, they use the example of a physician. Not every illness is the same. The illnesses that people have who live in a desert climate are going to be different from the illnesses that are common among people who live in the mountains. So the medicine that is common, the kind of wellness regime, in a sense, spiritual wellness regime that each prophet brings to these communities is going to be different. There's also a wisdom, particularly this comes in Ibn Arabi, where each of the prophets manifests a particular divine name. And so part of the divine infinitude, the fact that God has infinite divine names, means that the manifestation of God, the tajalliyat, need to be diverse. So you have Adam at the beginning, who manifests all the divine names, and you have the Prophet Muhammad at the end, who manifests all the divine names, or really manifests the name Allah, which is the all-comprehensive names. The prophets in the middle, inwardly they manifest Allah, inwardly they have the all-comprehensive name, but outwardly there's more of a focus on a particular name. So you can look at it two ways. One way is to look at the receptacle. Who is receiving the revelation? Is it people in mountains, or is it people in the desert, for example, to use the example we used before? The receptacle is different in different times and places. One is to look at it from the divine manifestation, the divine names and qualities that are so diverse, which name and quality is going to be manifested in each place in order for the manifestation of God to become complete. So these two together, that's part of the mystery of existence in the prophetology of particularly Ibn Arabi. These two come together, and that's the image of the fas, the bezel or the ringstone, is that there's a divine reality and there's a receptacle. The fas means both the gemstone and the bezel which receives the gemstone. These come together in this perfect unison, and that's what a prophet or a wali really is. It's that meeting point between the divine and the human, the receptacle of the vertical revelation, and also the receptacle being human and being able to spread that to other human beings. So both dimensions are here. Now the Ikhwan al-Safa and Al-Qudat, they're starting to move in that direction, but obviously Ibn Arabi has a much more kind of exhaustive exposition of this.
So in a summary, each prophet is a soul, which is a manifestation of certain God names and qualities. So each prophet is a unique manifestation of God, which is not similar to another prophet. And maybe also to the doctrine which they say لِكُلِّ اسم حكومة. So maybe in his place and time there was a governance of certain names. So that's why we see different expressions of the divine in this prophet or that.
Exactly, and that's the mystery of the two Quranic verses. You have لا نفرق بين أحد من رسله. We don't differentiate between any of the messengers. They all can bring the same message of Tawheed. They're all manifestations of the Ism Jama, Allah, but at the same time, فضلنا بعضهم على بعض. God has preferred some of them over others. They're differentiated as well between different names that they manifest.
Also, we have the آية لكل جعلنا شرعة ومنهاجا.
Exactly.
Okay, Doctor, now we'll go to a very important idea in the doctrine of Ayn al-Qudat, which is the circle, which is an example of the circle, where God is in the center. I hope we had a drawing to explain it better, where God is in the center, and the segment is Islam. So all different beliefs and practices related to God are included in this segment. And the edge will be the entry criteria. So the entry criteria will be, so how we can, now I think we're trying to applying his theory to all different people that live with all different religions and sectors and societies and languages. So how all different people will be inside the circle and God will be in the middle, and how all the circle will be Islam. So Islam is all the people, all humanity are Muslims.
All right, so it's important to note, so the circle is my idea. I'm trying to explain Ayn al-Qudat's theory and contrast it to other approaches to Islam. So that he doesn't talk about the circle directly, but it is related to other ideas that the Sufis have. So think about, if we think about God as the center of the circle, the circle itself represents, inside the circle is any belief related to God or any practice related to God. Outside the circle is beliefs and practices not related to God. Okay, so those ones we're not so interested in. The way most people define Islam is like a small segment. It's like a slice of that circle. You're either inside it or you're outside it. If you say Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, then you enter into that slice and you're a Muslim, and that's it. And the people who don't say that, they're outside it. So it's a very binary interpretation, and there's a reason for that. I'm not saying that's wrong or anything like that. But Ayn al-Qudat's idea is different, because he says anything that leads a person to God is Islam. That means any idea in that whole circle, if it's moving towards God, it's Islam. But if it's not moving towards God, if it's stationary, then it's kufr. So the idea of movement is really important here, and that's why I talk about Islam as a vector, just as a way of helping us understand that. So if we're in the circle, if we're doing anything related to God and it's moving us towards God, literally according to what Ayn al-Qudat says, that's Islam. And even if someone is within that sector of the identity of being Muslim, and they're not moving towards God, for Ayn al-Qudat, they're not Muslim. So crucially, to say in the same thing in today's language, Ayn al-Qudat is really criticizing the identity politics of Islam. Islam as an identity, as a political identity, has no benefit for him whatsoever, because so many people use that just simply not to get to God, but for their own worldly interests, for some other nafsani, selfish interest. So Ayn al-Qudat is saying what's the core of someone's belief, and potentially, even if someone doesn't have, you don't know that they're a Muslim or you don't see them as a Muslim, potentially if they're moving towards God, Ayn al-Qudat would include them and value them. Now, explicitly, he doesn't talk about other religions in that way. So he gives us some tools that you could apply that. If you take him literally, you could say anybody who's moving towards God is a Muslim. But he doesn't go into other religions in that kind of detail for us to understand whether he actually thinks that people outside of conventional Islam are moving towards God or not. He doesn't answer that. But the key thing here is to say to Muslims, look, you could be comfortable in your Islam, but if you're not moving towards God, you're not Muslim at all.
I think it's very interesting and deep here. We have to think in it a bit. Whereas we may have a Muslim who has the belief of Tawheed and the correct beliefs, and he has the practices of prayer and fasting, but he's not moving towards God. So he's not a Muslim in the definition of Ayn al-Qudat. How you can explain it more?
So I think Ayn al-Qudat would say if he actually believes in Tawheed, and he's actually saying his prayers properly, he is moving towards God. So he is a Muslim. But the problem is the people, the munafiqun, basically. The problem is the hypocrites. People who say they believe in Tawheed, but they're just saying it because everybody else says it. Or they're saying their prayers, but they're thinking about how to make money or something like that while they're saying their prayers. So he would say those people who aren't moving towards God, who are using religion as a tool to gain worldly things, to gain selfish goals, to gain power, those are the people who are not truly Muslims. But your ordinary person who believes in Tawheed and is saying his prayers, he is moving towards God, so he is a Muslim.
And then you talk about the different levels and stations of Muslims, because also hypocrisy are different levels and stations. So ordinary people, ordinary Muslims, they have a level of hypocrisy in a way or another, but then he'll talk about different stations.
Yes, there's lots of different levels for him. And there's a rhetoric that goes here. He tends to be very strict, actually, in this line. So he really wants to push you to be as sincere as possible, I would say. He's not going to go easy on people and say, you just have to say your prayers and that's it. He really wants you to look for that sincerity.
And then he has people outside the circle. So thanks God he has some mushrikeen or some kafirin, which are the bad people or oppressors or people who are very bad deeds or things. Because inside this circle, any person who's turning his face towards God, maybe he has a different religion, he has different practices, but there is a real turning towards God, then he can be inside the circle. And I don't know, maybe close, maybe far, but he's inside the circle. So the mafhum of kufr and shirk is different for him. So who is the people that he'll call kafirin? They are people from all different religions that are kafirin.
So again, he doesn't say this explicitly, but just to apply what he's saying, take literally what he's saying, that Islam is whatever takes someone to God, and kufr is what keeps you away from the path of God. Anybody who's not progressing towards God enters into kufr for him, is an infidel. So it's his idea of truth can be potentially very universal, but his idea of kufr can also be potentially very universal. So that's something also to bear in mind. It doesn't mean everybody is equal. It doesn't mean everybody's on the right path. He's very critical of the people of his time, actually. He's quite strict in the standards he has. So potentially people who think they're Muslims, if they're not sincere, then they would be within kufr, actually.
So no matter what your title is, what matters is what your heart is seeking. And we have a very famous saying which says, إن الله لا ينظر إلى صوركم or your ظاهر إنما ينظر إلى قلوبكم.
Yeah. He doesn't say that explicitly. I mean, his criterion is if you're moving towards God. So he doesn't say that intention is enough to move towards God. Usually he would say you need the guidance of someone who is a representative of God and the Prophet. In order to really move, you need that guidance. Just having a good intention isn't enough. But that intention probably would lead you to seek that. So it's about genuinely seeking the divine reality. But he doesn't go into so much details precisely about who does and who doesn't fulfill these criteria.
Yeah, I mean the intention that manifests in the person's act or deeds or in his seeking towards knowing truth.
Right.
So you also mentioned Islam is in principle any point within the circle, so long as that point possesses directionality towards the center. It may not be the case that every belief and practice does in fact lead to the center. This perspective does not suppose that every belief or practice is equally efficacious, but it certainly expands the notion of Islam to include potentially much more than is usually supposed, while also warning those who consider themselves safely within the segment of Islam as a religious identity to take a look at the direction that they are actually heading in. So if you have something to add.
Yeah, that sums it up pretty well. And again, I'm trying to be careful to only represent what Al-Qudat is saying, but also to suggest its implications. So I don't want to put words in his mouth. Other people can come up with a contemporary interpretation of his ideas and who would we look at today and that kind of thing. He completely reverses the logic of Islam and who is a Muslim. And he's placing the tariqah, the path, the rah, as in Persian, he's placing that at the center of Islam. So he's really placing Sufism at the center of Islam and making fiqh and kalam and so forth more marginal. Whereas at his time, fiqh and kalam had become the dominant sciences. So this is his key move, is to say it's the path to God that is the core of Islam. Mm-hmm. These other formal things, they might be stages on the way, that's fine. But they're not what constitutes Islam, and that's the core, I would say.
I think, and here he differentiates himself with different Sufi scholars, because in the traditional Sufi, thinking, they will say that fiqh is very basic and is necessary, and then akhlaq or irfan or the different stations are kamaliyat or mustahabbat. But they're not the core. So from the core you can go further, but you may not go. But I think Ayn al-Qudat is saying the core is not only fiqh, because fiqh will not reach you to anywhere without the tariqah, without the al-fada'il and the virtues and the real seeking towards good.
Exactly. That's exactly his move. Most people, even Sufis of his time and earlier, like Abu Nasr al-Sarraj, the way I interpret him, will say, okay, what is wajib is the fara'id, say your prayers, do your fasting, hold to fiqh. And then, as you said, you put it, the mustahabbat, Sufism is mustahab. Ayn al-Qudat says the opposite. He says, suluk, wayfaring, the journey to God is daruri. It's really wajib for him. That's the only thing humans need to do, is to journey towards God. Then if you practice fiqh, yes, that's because you need to do that in order to perform the journey. So the fiqh is secondary, and it's more relative, and actually the guidance of the spiritual master is more important for him than the guidance of the faqih. So Ayn al-Qudat is precisely, again, as I try to explain this, by turning Islam inside out. What is wajib on you is suluk. What is wajib on you is to journey back to God. That's the whole purpose of
So he's
Islam.
Changing the starting point for you. He's changing the starting point.
Changing the starting point, exactly, and he's changing the expectations. He's changing the whole process, so that, as I said, he does use the prayers. The way to get to God is to say your prayers, but the reason for doing that is different, and the way to go about seeking it is different too, because you need spiritual guidance in order to do that Seder Suluk. You need spiritual guidance for the wayfaring, so that guidance is crucial for him.
And now we'll go to the second part of our interview, which is the theory of al-madhahib عن القضاء. But before that, I think a very important question, the issue of...
So I don't want to put words into Ayn al-Qudat's mouth, because he doesn't say this explicitly, but I would say he strongly implies that yes, all of these people will reach the divine reality, because he says that underlying every single religion is the same truth. So the challenge is we can turn this into a contemporary theory of religious pluralism, but in order to do that, we need to add to it. So if you wanted to add to this and create a new constructive kind of theology based on Ayn al-Qudat, you could do that plausibly, but he doesn't quite go to that length.
So what do you think? What's your opinion? So based on Ayn al-Qudat's theory, we can build on it and reach to a certain claim in pluralism, you think?
So he gives, I would say, some really important tools. He says, okay, the starting point is the question, what actually leads to God? That's the starting point. He also, like the Quran, believes that all prophets have brought the same message. So that's also a really important point. Ultimately, though, for Ayn al-Qudat, the answer to this comes with ma'rifah. It's only someone who has gained ma'rifah who can fully discern between the truth and falsehood of different traditions. That's why you need a spiritual guide. A spiritual guide has been appointed by God in order to show you, okay, this approach is correct and this approach is not correct. So that authority placed in the spiritual guide for Ayn al-Qudat is really central, because it's only through ma'rifah that you can know.
So a spiritual guide is very essential for any salik.
Yes.
You mean by a spiritual guide like a prophet in general, a person connects with them spiritually, or no, a spiritual guide who is a scholar, a alim, a murshid, sheikh, tariqah, that's living with him?
So following a prophet is important for him, but he says you need a living representative of a prophet. But so the question is who that is, and for him it's the Sufi masters. So that person, ultimately God is the only guide for Al-Qudat, but the heart has to be very, very strong in order to receive the guidance of God directly. So most people, their heart can't tolerate God to guide them directly, so they need an intermediary. And the intermediary has to be a spiritual master, someone who's traveled the path, who's really ultimately annihilated in the Prophet, who's annihilated in God, and they can act as an intermediary for spiritual guidance. But that person has to be appointed by God. So nobody can claim themselves to be a spiritual guide. It has to be a function given to them by God.
But can't a person be the master of himself? Like, for example, if he didn't find a very great master in his country or in his time, so can't he find his path through the rituals and the doctrines of Islam and the doctrines of the Sufi tradition, and then going through the stations themselves? Just like these Sufi great scholars, they created themselves and their souls.
So the Ain al-Qudat's answer, which is the answer of classical Sufism, is that's impossible. And there's a classical Sufi saying, if you don't have a sheikh, then shaitan is your sheikh. Or they'll say, take an ant as your sheikh, but don't take your own nafs as your sheikh. So you can't transcend the ego, according to these thinkers, you can't transcend the ego through the ego. You need something beyond the ego. Now, there are occasional exceptions to the rule. God can make someone a wali instantly, but that person, the heart needs to be able to receive the divine reality directly, and that's not the case for ordinary people. So it's necessary to have somebody outside oneself who has reached that reality. Otherwise, the journey is not possible. You're just simply following your own nafs. So for Ain al-Qudat, this idea of a human spiritual authority is, I would say, one of his key doctrines.
Institutionalizing Sufism and creating a social identity also for the Sufi seekers, and any person who's not in favor of being in touch with such a master will not have the opportunity to go to this path and to go overcome these stations.
So what's interesting here is we're at an interesting stage in the socialization of Sufism, but the Sufi orders have not emerged yet in Ain al-Qudat's time. They emerge about a century after that. So it's really individual spiritual masters gather a following around themselves. But the key thing here is that either that person is appointed by God or they're not. If someone is not appointed by God, they're simply claiming to be a spiritual master. And for Ain al-Qudat, that's not efficacious. But if someone is appointed by God, then by following them, the salik is following God. Mm-hmm. So the person who doesn't want to follow a spiritual master to get to God doesn't really want to find God for Ain al-Qudat. They just want to follow their own ego.
Great, Doctor. Here is the issue of abrogation, naskh, also will come here in pluralism. So whether in your opinion or how you understand or you can apply Ain al-Qudat's theory. So because as a Muslim scholar, we believe that Islam abrogated all other shara'a. So a person should obey to Islam in order to reach to very high levels of spirituality. But in pluralism, we're saying that paths are open and whoever turns his face towards God can reach. So what about abrogation? Or abrogation is only in Sharia, so the haqiqa and the tariqa were not abrogated, so the path is also open?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. And Ain al-Qudat only makes a few references to this. So in one of his texts, he, as you know, he was executed on charges of heresy. For political reasons. But before that, he was taken to prison and he was interrogated on the basis of these ideas. Actually, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who is such a important influence on Ain al-Qudat, but the criteria that he laid out of does God know particulars, is the world eternal, and is resurrection bodily, and also on this charge of being an Ismaili. Ain al-Qudat was interrogated on all of these, and he writes an Ash'ari creed at that time, which does suggest that Islam is kind of abrogates other religions. So there's a challenge here because he wrote that under duress, but at the same time he does his starting point is the Shafi'i Ash'ari position on many issues, and then he kind of moves beyond it in this suluk. So it's a really challenging issue to see what he thinks. One statement I found is that he said about Zoroastrianism. He says the Zoroastrianism in the times that I've seen seems to be corrupted. It doesn't seem to be a true religion. But I don't know whether this corruption happened after the coming of Islam or before it. So that statement suggests that he considers it possible that at the time Islam came, Zoroastrianism could have been an authentic religion. So he doesn't explicitly talk about Nasr, except in this one text, which again was written under duress. His theory seems to be more universalist than this. All his practical examples are from Islamic practices. I think he probably, like most thinkers, very few pre-modern Muslim thinkers knew a lot about, let's say, the doctrine of the Trinity. His ideas of Christianity and Judaism are pretty limited. So he doesn't go deeply into the nature of other traditions, and he doesn't explicitly talk about abrogation in basically all of his writings.
Great. So in the time that's left, I'd like to talk about the theories of the madhahib and Al-Qudat. So we cover that part also because it's important, related. So Ikhwan al-Safa's approach, and you mentioned, our brethren, Ikhwanuna, must not be averse to any science or any book or take sides against any doctrine, madhab. For our view and doctrine encompasses all the doctrines and gathers together all the sciences. Where we have the different expression of truths through different so different ideas. It's like the idea that's mentioned in Mathnawi maybe. So when I want to describe this fruit, I'll say inab, you will say grapes, and that person will say angur. Or even in the names of God and Allah and Parwardigar and these different names. Similar to the Sufi poets, when they say people different describing reality from the direction that they're looking on, and wherever you see, you'll find the face of God. Another idea you're mentioning is that do not busy yourself with mentioning the faults of the madhahibs of the people, but look and see whether you have a madhab without fault. So concentrate on yourself, not in criticizing others. So how you can summarize the idea here that he's presenting?
Yeah, this is a key idea, both in the Ikhwan al-Safa and in Al-Qudat, and basically across Sufi poetry and Persian in general as well, that tradition as well. There's a constant problem in society, in Islamic societies, where being Muslim is a value, where being Muslim and being pious is praised, in that people turn that into an ego trip. People turn that into egoism to say, oh, this other person is not as pious as me. This other person is following the wrong religion. I'm the only true religion, I'm the only person following a true religion, and so on and so forth. So they're all criticizing ta'assub, or partisanship. And partisanship, ta'assub, is really coming from the ego. So basically, Ikhwan al-Safa and Al-Qudat are saying, why bother with other people's religions and criticizing them? Focus on your own religion, focus on your own search for God, and leave everything else aside, leave everybody else in God's hands.
Also, there is the story of Nabi Ibrahim, his journey towards God, seeing the moon, seeing the sun, and then his final faith towards the face of God. Does it suggest that he has in mind that that the journey from the lower to the higher levels of belief of people who are seeking God on different levels is also accepted, where God is manifested and close to the person, even through false beliefs? Or
so again, this relates to Ain al-Qudat's idea that everything is about suluk, everything is about the journey to God, and what you need to do is just keep going, don't stop anywhere. So he uses the idea, the story of Abraham. Abu Hamid al-Ghazali also uses this in Mishkat al-Anwar, of saying there are some beliefs that are more limited than other ones, and from a certain perspective represent kufr. But that might be a middle point on the journey. So again, you get to that point. It's not that is entirely false. That's a stepping stone for you to transcend it. So what you need to do, your belief may be limited, but it's not black and white. You should go from that limited position and keep journeying towards the divine reality. So again, you can't judge other people for their limited beliefs, because they may be on the journey too. So the capital sin in Al-Qudat is stopping. If you stop at the star, that's a mistake. But if you go onto the moon, the sun, and then realize the nature of God, then that's correct.
But in the doctrine here of Ayn al-Qudaa, how can we be sure that we're not falling into relativism? So for example, Descartes, al-Shak, or al-Nisbiyya, which is related to some of the Western philosophy nowadays. So at the same time, we're respecting different religions and doctrines and beliefs from the God manifested point of view, so not from the false side. And at the same time, we don't want to fall into relativism and everything is right, everything is nice, and everything can reach towards God, and there is no mistakes and there is no shirk. And so what's the precise point here?
Exactly. That's the key point, is that he wants his readers both to always be discerning between truth and falsehood in every belief, and to affirm the truth and negate the falsehood in that belief. So that's a constant process. It's a constant process in what we encounter outside, but it's also a constant internal process. And this becomes internalized when we look at every idea we have, every intention we have, and we constantly try to purify the soul of the negative intentions. Now, the criterion for him is ma'rifah. You need direct knowledge of divine realities in order to really discern between truth and falsehood. And if you haven't gained that yet, you need a spiritual guide.
Also, the term madhahib, it is ما ذهب إليه الإنسان. So it's ways of going. So different religion sectors and all different school of thoughts and laws in the world can be madhahib of people. So so he's asking us to get rid of these madhahib, and the madhab of Allah madhab, or it's here what you mentioned, the end point is without any madhab, or the madhab of my Lord, as Hallaj says. You mentioned this earlier. Or there is no village beyond Abadan. ليس وراء عبدان قرية. So you overcome the fields of madhab and search about the madhab of Allah, or the madhab al-haqiqi, and it's the state of colorlessness instead of having one color, or مقام لا مقام, or لا أريد إلا ما يريد. I think عرفاء mentioning this in many expressions.
Yes, so ultimately, for Al-Qudat, ultimately it's fana fillah. The annihilation in God is beyond all madhabs. There can be no madhab when there's pure unity, but madhabs are still necessary until you get there. So there has to be a journey through different opinions, different points of view, under guidance, under spiritual guidance, until you reach the point beyond all of that. And it would be very dangerous for someone to claim that they'd reached the point of la madhab before fana fillah. That's the important.
So as a starting point, each person will need a madhab, the madhab that he believes is true, because we have different practices and rituals and different doctrines, theological doctrines. So each person will choose one, because there are Ash'ari and there al-Mufawwidha, Imamis in the beliefs, and then the practices Ash'ari, Hanafi, Ja'fari. So each person should choose one as a starting point until he reaches high, or no, or he should respect all, or what should he do?
Al-Qudat says you shouldn't choose one based on what you've been born into. He says you should consider them all equal, and then search for the truth and search for true spiritual guidance, and then choose your practice based on that spiritual guidance. So again, at the beginning, he's a big critic of what he calls adat parasti, the worship of adat, the worship of habits. So if you're simply doing something because that's what your parents told you to do, you're worshipping an idol of aada, of a habit.
Or society, or peer effect, or the community, or...
So the community, exactly. So you need to actually set that aside and seek God, but seek God through people who know God. Seek God through people who know God, and then on the basis of what they teach you, then you choose your practice and so forth.
So basically you are saying choose your madhab based on tahqiq, not based on taqleed, and then exactly. you need one madhab. You can't practice different madhabs at the same time, but from this madhab you should go further, and you should respect the truth that is manifested in different madhab also at the same time.
So the key thing here is there's a difference between theory and practice. So when we use the word madhab today, we mean legal school, right? but he uses the term madhab much more to mean philosophical school. So the practice for Al-Qudat is really what your teacher has given you, which for him it's very similar to kind of Shafi'i forms of prayer and so forth, and the Sufi practices as well, but on a theoretical basis to be able to see the truth of multiple schools of thought. And that's what he calls madhab. So theoretically, you can view the truth everywhere, but in terms of practice, you have to follow the instructions you've been given by your guide.
Great. So here you also mentioned satisfaction with what one has already attained is one of the great obstacles for a salik. And then you mentioned the example of Hamadan and Baghdad. They are way stations to Mecca for someone coming from Khorasan. But it's not appropriate to take up residence there. For a way station is never a place of residence. And if someone makes a residence of a way station, then his path will be blocked. And so, Nicholas, I think that the major sin is habit worship, as you mentioned now. This is related to the ayah, إن الله لا يغير ما بقوم حتى يغيروا ما بأنفسهم. So it has a very deep Quranic root, because you should take care of your soul and get rid of partisanship, which is ta'assub, by saying that my beliefs are true and the full stop, and they are the only true beliefs. And this is a vice which ruins the heart and destroys intelligence, as you said, which is also related to. So we have taqlid and ta'assub and adat parasti, three bad things.
Exactly. As you say, the cardinal sin, as we mentioned, is stopping on the path. So he even says spiritual experience can stop you on the path. And he talks about a young girl in Baghdad who had become famous because she could read people's minds and she could solve their problems miraculously. She had this spiritual insight, which was just a gift from God. So she could help a lot of people, and she'd become very famous. And Al-Qudat said because of those miracles, she'd stopped journeying towards God. So he actually says even miraculous experiences, miraculous powers, and so on and so forth are an obstacle to God, because the goal of all of this is God. It's not to be able to read people's minds or anything like that. So whether it be from ta'assub, or whether it be from just having a wonderful experience or something like that, the cardinal sin is just to stop on the path. You always have to keep going, keep transcending your limitations, because God is beyond all limitations.
You also mention an interesting thing in the article when you talk about the idea that the level beyond the intellect can't be addressed by language, or what we call in Arabic طور وراء طور العقل, or أرجل الاستدلاليين من خشب. And then you mentioned this story, how a recitation of the opening chapter of the Quran would be interpreted by a Turk who knows no Arabic, compared to a person who has a high level. So this person may have a high level of spiritual path, and by the addressed himself who has knowledge of Arabic but is portrayed as a relative beginner in spiritual matters. So the Turk will gain a profound understanding of the inner message being communicated, even though he doesn't know the language.
So I'll clarify that example. So Al-Qudat is expressing the different levels of knowledge, and this difference between ilm and ma'rifah. So he says, okay, take one person, doesn't have to be a Turk, it could be an Englishman, doesn't know any Arabic. When he hears the Fatiha, he just hears some language that he doesn't understand. Take an Arabic speaker, someone with excellent knowledge of Arabic. He hears the literal meaning. Then take someone who is one of the awliya, for example. He or she hears the deepest meaning of that Fatiha. So everybody experiences the same thing in one sense, but what they know about it is completely different. So that means, first of all, humility. If you don't understand what the awliya, what the Sufis are talking about, don't criticize them, because they might be seeing a deeper meaning that you don't have access to. The second is the tawr wara al-aql. Basically, he says that ilm can be communicated when you have a teacher, a student, and they speak using concepts. That's enough for ilm. Ilm is conceptual knowledge. For ma'rifah, you need a teacher, a student, but you also the words, but you also need a divine grace which descends. So ma'rifah is never contained within concepts. the concepts are always ambiguous, and they allude to ma'rifah. They can help spark the ma'rifah. They can get rid of the clouds, let's say, so the sunlight of ma'rifah can shine upon your heart. But the words themselves are never sufficient to convey ma'rifah. So that means the teachings of Al-Qudat, the teachings of the Sufis, are always beyond language, and you have to travel the path. Again, this is always what he's talking about. You have to travel the path until you understand what these words really mean. So if you don't understand what the Sufis talk about for Al-Qudat, just start practicing, start traveling the path. And he says, Bosh, Toberesi, just wait until you get there. Just wait until you get there. Stay on the path, keep practicing, and eventually you'll understand.
So the words of the Quran will only shine for a salik.
Exactly. You'll be able to go deeper and deeper based on the saluk. Exactly.
This is related very thoroughly to the idea of Sayyid Haydar al-Amuli. We have 3 books, the book of the soul and the book of the Quran and the book of the horizons. So you should read and you should correspond between these 3 books.
Exactly. So again, Al-Qudat Hamdani is about going from the Zahir to the Batin. That's the whole journey, is about being able to interpret the cosmos, being able to interpret the soul, and being able to interpret the Quran deeper and deeper. So this is true for Amali, and it's true for other figures as well.
So Dr. Nicholas, also we mentioned this idea that all madhahibs were originally true, but some have become corrupted by bad transmitters. Similarly, what happens in the transmission of hadith, when the Prophet says the hadith and all the obstacles that come until the hadith reach us?
Exactly. So because as we discussed, ma'rifah can't be communicated by concepts. You can only understand what the concepts really mean by journeying and by arriving there. Therefore, if you just hear the sayings of the Sufis and transmit them to someone else, if you change the words just a little bit, it might completely destroy the meaning. So, for example, imagine someone who didn't know Arabic, and they hear Muslims saying La ilaha illallah, and he comes to his friend and say, these Muslims go around saying La ilaha, and he forgets the second part of the statement. Has the completely opposite meaning. So Al-Qudat's idea is really fascinating, actually, that all religious beliefs, all religious doctrines had an origin in truth, but then people who hadn't seen that, hadn't gained the ma'rifah, talked about it, and they ended up getting things wrong, and that's how corruption happens for him in religious doctrines.
It's interesting that he's building his ideas based on some hadith also. So this hadith that we have, there will come a time when the people gather in the mosques and pray, and there is not a Muslim among them. So he's referring to the idea that the real Islam is not only about practicing, but about having the tariqah before practicing.
Exactly. Again, this problem of taqleed. If people are simply doing it, that doesn't mean they're real Muslims. And that's precisely what they're worried about, the disappearance of true, authentic Islam. And what remains is formal Islam without the spirit. And again, this refers to a hadith that there'll come a time where people recite the Quran and it doesn't go past their necks, it doesn't enter into their hearts.
Great. You also mentioned that one who is truly accomplished on the way is able to see the truth underlying the diverse forms of religiosity that he encounters, and to explain it to others, even if the practitioners of these forms may have lost touch with the truth themselves. So I think the point added is the final point in this sentence.
Yes. So Al-Qudat thinks, as we mentioned earlier, that a wayfarer can eventually see the reality behind practices that have now become, in his view, corrupted. So if we take the example of the people praying in the mosque, he uses the example of Zoroastrianism or Christianity. But if we take the example of the people praying in the mosque, if they don't know what they're doing, he can come and explain to them, no, this is the real meaning of the prayer, for example. He can come and explain to the Zoroastrians, this is the real meaning of fire worship. So it's the salik, again, who gains the ma'rifah, who knows the truth behind things and the true core, and potentially then can help people understand it and restore that truth to them.
This is the hakim, or the wise person, as Urafa always say. The final point in your very interesting article, it's a whole theory, which is, I think you're quoting here, you're quoting 2 ayahs, which are very important. Who listen to the word, then follow what is most beautiful of it. It is they whom God has guided, it is they who are the possessors of the intellect. I think you're mentioning the ayah, الذين يستمعون القول فيتبعون أحسنه, and we mentioned something about this ayah. But the other ayah, oh God, lead us to that of the truth that has been disagreed upon with thy permission. واهدنا لما اختلف فيه من الحق بإذنك. And he has a great interpretation about this ayah also.
Yeah, this is a dua attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. And again, it's precisely that idea that the person who's seeking God is seeking God in everything. So he's asking for guidance to see the truth in the disagreements between people, to see the truth on every side of the disagreement, really, even if one side is more correct, but to see the truth and as we've said many times already, to distinguish between truth and falsehood in everything. So you take the truth of this position and leave the falsehood. You take the truth of this position and leave the falsehood, because ultimately that the true Muslim for Al-Qudat is only interested in the truth. He's not interested in sectarian identity or partisanship. He's simply interested in discovering God, seeing the truth, wherever it might be.
By this, I think we talked about most of the ideas about Al-Qudat al-Hamdani and religious pluralism. But before we finalize, Doctor, because I was reading other articles of you about Sayyid Haidar al-Amuli and things, so there is a passage here. Can we find really, or can we find tools from the theories of Sayyid Haidar al-Amuli which will help us in a similar idea about religious pluralism? Because he was mentioning also they see their station and level, like awliya or urafa, as the middle point, and the ways are diverse, متنوعة, طرق المتنوعة as regards to madhabs and milal, like the lines emerging from the circumference to the center, and all are excused in one respect. So I think it's similar to the idea of the circle. And so if you have something to comment here.
So this is a pretty technical theory, and it comes from Ibn Arabi's thought, really, in Ibn Arabi's ontology. What Sayyid Haidar al-Amali is really saying here is the whole of the cosmos, including people's religious beliefs, is a manifestation of the divine word. Just as the Quran contains the name of Pharaoh, Fir'aun, and talks about the disbelievers, the world contains disbelievers, and it contains oppressive people. But there's a sense in which these people are also a manifestation of the word of God. Not insofar as they limit the truth, obviously that's a limitation, but simply insofar as they exist and play a role, a broader function within the cosmos. So Sayyid Haidar Amali will talk about the fact that whenever there's a prophet, there's an opponent. You always have, if there's Prophet Muhammad, you have Abu Jahl. If you have Moses, you have Pharaoh. So there's always someone in creation who plays the role of trying to misguide people, but that's part of the creation itself. Now, that also means that there are multiple manifestations of the truth. So this goes back to what we were talking about before about the different names and qualities. So everything in the cosmos, including different religious beliefs, is a manifestation of different names and qualities. Rahmah encompasses everyone. Rahmati wasa'at kulla shay. But that also doesn't mean that they're all equally correct. For Sayyid Haidar Amali.
And Sayyid Haidar also mentions this verses from the poem of Ibn Arabi, which starts, "My heart has become receptive to every form," until the poem says, "I profess the religion of love wherever it turns." I think فالحب ديني وإيماني in Arabic, so love is my religion. So you have something to comment in your opinion about this verse and its relation to our talk?
So it relates to the idea in Al-Qudat that we were talking about, that the Arif is able to see the truth in everything, but also to see the limitations as well. But in this verse, Ibn Arabi is focusing on seeing the truth. Everything is a ta'ayyun of wujud for Ibn Arabi. Everything is a manifestation of the divine names and qualities. So even idol worship is a manifestation of certain divine names and qualities. So in a theoretical perspective, one can see God everywhere. Wheresoever you turn, there is the face of God. But in a practical perspective, you only follow one path. And for Ibn Arabi, particularly following the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad is important. So the Quran says, wheresoever you turn, there is the face of God. But you still have to pray towards Mecca. So Ibn Arabi has a nice description of this, that it's out of adab for the divine command that you pray towards Mecca, and also to follow the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad. But you also see God in every direction. And that's true for different religious beliefs as well. You see the truth in everything, but then you follow the one that leads to the highest felicity.
I think this is also related to the idea of الأمر الوجودي and أمر التكليفي. So in الأمر الوجودي, all the people are موحد, or all the people are مسبح even. But in the أمر التكليفي, people should follow this path. So even exactly. The صراط المستقيم, when we talk about the existential صراط المستقيم, إن ربي على صراط المستقيم, ما من دابة إلا هو أخذ بناصيتها. All the people are going, they will go back to God, either to hell or to heaven. But exactly. That doesn't mean that people shouldn't look and search for the correct path.
Exactly. And Sayyid Haider Amali is precisely thinking about that verse. He quotes that verse, and he quotes Ibn Arabi's commentary on that verse as well.
So in the same time that people are going towards God, that doesn't mean that we are respecting all these different kinds of paths. So even if we say paths to God, بعدد أنفاس الخلائق, it doesn't mean that they are all correct and God wants from them to be on these paths. Yeah.
Exactly. It's the distinction here between Rahma Rahmaniya and Rahma Rahimiyya is useful here. So the Rahma Rahmaniya is the wujud, it's the existence, Rahma that existentiates things. Rahmati wasa'at kulla shay. The very fact that something exists means it's encompassed by divine mercy. That's the literal meaning of the Quran. So there's a Rahma for everybody. God gives the rizq to everybody. Everybody's rizq is determined. God gives existence to everybody. But the Rahma Rahmaniya, the Rahma Rahimiyya is only for the believers. So the Rahma, the mercy that brings us back to God and in felicity, is only for the believers. So this distinction is crucial. Ultimately, for Ibn Arabi, the people who end up in the hellfire, ultimately, they also are within the divine mercy, but it's incomparable with, they're veiled from God. It's incomparable with the bliss that is experienced by the people who are able to enter the garden. So it's not a black and white theory. It's an extremely subtle theory that is both encompassing and delimiting at the same time.
So we're reaching towards the end, Doctor. So after presenting all these ideas about religious pluralism, especially from the doctrine of Urafa and Sufi masters and doctrine of Al-Qudat al-Hamdani, so in your idea, because you're too much interested in this research and you're working about Sayyid Haidar's Amuli's theory and Sana'i's theory in this issue also, so what are the main results that you think that, or what's the importance of talking and insisting and presenting such theories in understanding Islam, or in respecting other people, or in understanding deeply the message of God to us?
I would say the fundamental teaching of all of these figures, whether it be in the Persian literary tradition or in the Sufi, metaphysical Sufi tradition of the school of Ibn Arabi, the fundamental teaching is a call for us to return to our own hearts and to cultivate our humanity in its fullest sense. And part of that cultivation of humanity is to be able to see the truth wherever it manifests. So there is a universality here in being able to see all manifestations of truth and not to be limited by ta'assub, by egoism. So first of all, there's an ethical call to polish the ego, to get rid of egoism and to get rid of ta'assub. But secondly, there's also this question of what path will actually lead you to that felicity. What path will lead you to realizing the fullness of human nature? And in order to choose a specific path, that means excluding other ones, at least on the level of practice. So the specific practical guidance can be quite specific in these texts. So there's both a universalizing move, which is to see truth everywhere. And there's a practical move based on take the specific step that you need to take in order to really realize your humanity. And ultimately, forget about other people. Don't worry about whether the person next to you is a believer or an unbeliever. Only God knows that. Get rid of these ideas, get rid of these ideas of judging other people. Focus on your own state and your own relationship to God, and guide people through your example and through goodness. There's no need for us to be judging other people. That function, according to all of these poets and thinkers and philosophers, belongs to God alone.
Great. Such an interesting theory. And I think, Doctor, all the people who are studying religious pluralism in the Irfani doctrine, or in general, or in the Quran, and every day they'll find new secrets and new dimensions of research. I think because it's not easy. I think it's very complicated, and the issue is the issue that is related to Islam, to Quran, to Tawheed, to the paths of God. So it's related to many different main themes and theories in all the religious studies, you believe?
That's right. It's a very complicated topic, and it needs you to delve into all these different sciences, which makes it really fascinating to study.
So thank you for being us, Doctor. Thank you for sharing all these knowledge and insight.
Thank you very much.